The invitation arrived quietly, without excitement or ceremony. It was a short message, polite and practical, asking if she would be willing to play the piano at a small local event. Nothing about it sounded special. It was not a competition, not a concert hall, not even a place known for music. It was simply a community gathering where a piano would be placed in the corner of a modest room. The message explained clearly what they wanted. They were not looking for anything complex, just a simple piano tune. Something calm, something familiar, something that would blend into the background while people talked, smiled, and waited for the next part of the program. The words were kind but firm. They did not want surprises. She read the message more than once. Not because it was confusing, but because it felt familiar. Requests like this had followed her for most of her life. People often asked her to play, but rarely expected much. They assumed she would deliver something soft and ordinary, something easy to forget. She did not feel offended. She never did. Over time, she had learned that expectations were often shaped before she ever entered the room. People saw her and made quiet decisions. They decided what she could do, how far she could go, and how much attention she deserved. She had stopped trying to correct them with words. Music was where she spoke. Still, she paused before replying. Not because she was unsure of herself, but because she understood what this invitation really meant. It meant being placed in a small space, given small expectations, and asked to stay within them. It meant being treated as background sound rather than a performer. She looked around the room where she practiced every day. The piano was old, its surface worn from years of use. Some keys were slightly faded. It was not a grand piano. It never had been. But it had carried her through countless hours of quiet work. Early mornings, late nights, long days when no one was listening. She sat down and played a few notes softly at first. The sound filled the room in a gentle way. She closed her eyes and let her hands move slowly, not because she was warming up, but because she was remembering the many times she had played for herself alone, with no audience, no applause, and no promise that anyone would ever hear her. The invitation did not change her plans for the day. She still practiced as she always did. She still played scales. She still repeated difficult passages until her fingers moved without thought. This discipline was not new. It had been built over years of patience. Later that evening, she replied with a simple yes. She did not add extra words. She did not ask questions. She did not suggest anything more ambitious. She accepted the invitation exactly as it was given. On the surface, it looked like agreement. Inside, it was something else entirely. In the days that followed, the event organizer sent a few more messages. They shared the date, the time, and the location. Each message repeated the same idea. Keep it simple. Keep it light. Play something easy that everyone would recognize. Nothing intense. Nothing dramatic. She read each message carefully. She understood their concern. They did not want to risk discomfort. They wanted control. They wanted something safe. She replied politely every time. What they did not ask was what kind of music lived inside her. They did not ask how long she had been playing. They did not ask what she loved, or what she had written, or what she dreamed of sharing one day. They assumed none of that mattered. At the same time, she was preparing in her own quiet way. She practiced the simple tune they had requested. She made sure she could play it perfectly, without mistakes, without effort. She respected the request. She always respected music, even when it was small. But after that, when the room was silent and the world outside felt distant, she played something else. These moments were not about rebellion. They were about truth. About the music that had grown inside her through years of restraint. Music shaped by moments of being overlooked. Music formed in silence. She did not tell anyone she was working on something more. There was no reason to. She had learned that announcing plans often invited doubt. Silence allowed freedom. As the day of the event grew closer, she felt no nervous excitement. There was no pressure, no fear. This was not a moment she had built expectations around. If anything, it felt like another routine appearance. Another small stage. Another audience that would listen without really hearing. Yet something felt different. Not outside, but inside her. She thought about how often people had tried to place limits on her without meaning to be unkind. Teachers who suggested she focus on easier pieces. Listeners who complimented her soft touch, but never asked for more. Invitations that came with instructions to stay small. She understood what this invitation really meant. It meant being placed in a small space, given small expectations, and asked to stay within them. It meant being treated as background sound rather than a performer. She looked around the room where she practiced every day. The piano was old, its surface worn from years of use. Some keys were slightly faded. It was not a grand piano. It never had been. But it had carried her through countless hours of quiet work. Early mornings, late nights, long days when no one was listening. She sat down and played a few notes softly at first. The sound filled the room in a gentle way. She closed her eyes and let her hands move slowly, not because she was warming up, but because she was remembering the many times she had played for herself alone, with no audience, no applause, and no promise that anyone would ever hear her. The invitation did not change her plans for the day. She still practiced as she always did. She still played scales. She still repeated difficult passages until her fingers moved without thought. This discipline was not new. It had been built over years of patience. Later that evening, she replied with a simple yes. She did not add extra words. She did not ask questions. She did not suggest anything more ambitious. She accepted the invitation exactly as it was given. On the surface, it looked like agreement. Inside, it was something else entirely. In the days that followed, the event organizer sent a few more messages. They shared the date, the time, and the location. Each message repeated the same idea. Keep it simple. Keep it light. Play something easy that everyone would recognize. Nothing intense. Nothing dramatic. She read each message carefully. She understood their concern. They did not want to risk discomfort. They wanted control. They wanted something safe. She replied politely every time. What they did not ask was what kind of music lived inside her. They did not ask how long she had been playing. They did not ask what she loved, or what she had written, or what she dreamed of sharing one day. They assumed none of that mattered. At the same time, she was preparing in her own quiet way. She practiced the simple tune they had requested. She made sure she could play it perfectly without mistakes, without effort. She respected the request. She always respected music, even when it was small. But after that, when the room was silent and the world outside felt distant, she played something else. These moments were not about rebellion. They were about truth. About the music that had grown inside her through years of restraint. Music shaped by moments of being overlooked. Music formed in silence. She did not tell anyone she was working on something more. There was no reason to. She had learned that announcing plans often invited doubt. Silence allowed freedom. As the day of the event grew closer, she felt no nervous excitement. There was no pressure, no fear. This was not a moment she had built expectations around. If anything, it felt like another routine appearance. Another small stage. Another audience that would listen without really hearing. Yet something felt different. Not outside, but inside her. She thought about how often people had tried to place limits on her without meaning to be unkind. Teachers who suggested she focus on easier pieces. Listeners who complimented her soft touch, but never asked for more. Invitations that came with instructions to stay small. She understood now that these limits were not walls. They were assumptions. And assumptions could be broken without argument. The night before the event, she sat alone with the piano. The lights were dim. The world felt still. She played the simple tune one last time, letting it flow naturally. It sounded exactly as expected. Pleasant, safe, forgettable. Then she paused. Her hands hovered over the keys, and she felt the weight of every quiet year behind her. Every practice session that no one saw. Every moment she chose discipline over recognition. Every time she held back because it wasn't the right place or time. She knew the invitation had asked for something simple, and she would begin that way. She would honor the request. She would respect the space. But she also knew something else. Sometimes the smallest invitations become the greatest chances. Not because they promise recognition, but because they offer freedom when no one is watching closely. She closed the piano gently and stood up. Tomorrow would come soon enough. The invitation was modest. The expectations were low. And that was exactly what made the moment powerful, even before a single note was played. She did not wake up one day knowing she could surprise people. That belief was built slowly, shaped by years of quiet effort and moments that rarely felt important at the time. From the outside, her journey looked ordinary. From the inside, it was full of patience, restraint, and long stretches of silence. She grew up around sound, but not around attention. Music was always present, yet never celebrated. The piano entered her life in a simple way, placed in a corner like furniture rather than a dream. At first, she treated it the same way others did, something familiar but not special. But over time, her hands began to return to it without being told. She was never the loud student. She did not rush to perform in front of others. When lessons were offered, she listened more than she spoke. Her progress was steady, but it did not demand notice. Teachers noticed effort, but effort alone rarely impressed anyone. When people talked about talent, they often spoke about confidence, speed, or boldness. She showed none of that. She moved carefully. She learned slowly, not because she lacked ability, but because she wanted to understand every sound fully. This made her easy to overlook. In group settings, she blended into the background. Others were encouraged to play more often, to try harder pieces, to perform at events. She was usually given simpler parts. Nobody said it was because they doubted her. They said it was because she was reliable, calm, consistent. Those words sounded kind, but they came with limits. She noticed how expectations formed early. Once someone decided what level she belonged to, it rarely changed. Even when she improved, the image stayed the same. She was the one who played cleanly, quietly, without risk. At first, she accepted it. She believed that growth would eventually speak for itself. She believed that if she worked hard enough, someone would notice. So she worked. She practiced when the room was empty. She practiced when others stopped. She repeated the same passages until they felt natural, then repeated them again. Not for praise, not for grades, but because something inside her needed it. She learned how music could carry emotion without words, how a pause could say more than sound, how control mattered more than speed. These lessons did not come from applause. They came from listening closely. Over time, she began to explore beyond what she was given. She played pieces no one asked her to play. She studied techniques that were never assigned. When something felt difficult, she did not avoid it. She broke it down quietly and worked through it alone. Still, the outside world saw little change. When small opportunities came, they came with conditions. Keep it easy. Keep it short. Play something pleasant. The same phrases repeated themselves in different places. Different rooms, same expectations. She learned not to react. She learned not to argue. Arguing never changed anyone's mind. It only made them defensive. Instead, she nodded and did what was asked. Some days that was harder than practice. There were moments when she questioned herself. Not her ability, but her place. She wondered if being unnoticed meant she truly lacked something others had. Confidence, maybe, or the right personality, or simply the right timing. But whenever doubt grew loud, she returned to the piano. Music never questioned her. It responded honestly. When she played with focus, the sound deepened. When she rushed, it showed. There was no judgment, only feedback. That fairness kept her going. She began to write her own music in small pieces. Nothing dramatic at first. Short ideas. Simple patterns. She treated them like private thoughts. She did not share them. They were not meant to impress anyone. They were meant to exist. As years passed, her skill grew stronger than her reputation. She knew things others did not expect her to know. Her hands could move with speed and control when needed. Her sense of timing became sharp. Her understanding of emotion deepened. Yet she remained categorized as safe. This did not make her angry. It made her careful. She watched others perform bold pieces before they were ready, supported by confidence and attention. Some succeeded. Some struggled. She learned from both. She saw how performance was not only about skill but about belief, about what people expected to hear. And she understood something important. Expectations shape listening. If people expect simplicity, they listen lightly. If they expect greatness, they listen closely. Most people had never listened closely to her. Instead of resenting this, she used it. She stopped waiting for approval. She stopped hoping someone would suddenly see her differently. She decided that when the moment came, it would not be announced. It would arrive quietly, like everything else in her life. Her discipline became personal. She practiced not to prove herself, but to be ready. Ready for a moment she could not predict. Ready for a space where assumptions would work in her favor. There were times when she could have pushed harder for attention. She could have insisted on harder pieces. She could have challenged the roles given to her. But she chose patience instead. Not because she was afraid, but because she trusted timing. She knew that skill revealed at the wrong moment could be dismissed. Skill revealed unexpectedly could not. So she stayed in the background, growing stronger where no one was watching. By the time the modest invitation arrived, she was no longer the person people thought she was. She had moved far beyond the image placed on her years ago. The gap between perception and reality had grown wide, and that gap held power. She carried her past lightly. The overlooked moments no longer felt like losses. They felt like preparation. Every quiet practice session, every small request, every underestimated appearance had sharpened her control. She was not bitter. She was focused. She understood that being overlooked had given her freedom. Freedom to learn without pressure. Freedom to fail without judgment. Freedom to build something real instead of something visible. The world around her still saw simplicity, still assumed calm meant limited, still believed that quiet meant ordinary. She did not correct them. She knew something they did not. The strongest fire often burns unseen, until the moment it is finally allowed to show itself. She arrived at the venue earlier than necessary, not because she was anxious, but because arriving early had always given her a sense of control. The place looked exactly like she expected. Modest, quiet, and practical. Chairs were arranged in neat rows. A small stage sat at the front, and the piano rested slightly off to the side, as if it were an accessory rather than the focus of the event. People moved around the room, checking papers, adjusting microphones, and greeting one another with casual smiles. No one seemed rushed. No one seemed concerned about the music. It was clear that the piano was there to fill space, not command attention. She stood near the entrance for a moment, observing. This had become a habit over the years. Before stepping into any space, she liked to understand the mood, the energy, the expectations that floated silently in the air. The expectations here were light, comfortable, almost careless. A few people glanced in her direction as she walked in, their eyes briefly acknowledging her presence before moving on. There was no curiosity, no pause. She was simply the pianist who would play something pleasant later. Nothing more. Someone from the organizing team approached her with a polite smile. They thanked her for coming and reminded her of the plan. She would play shortly after the opening remarks. Just one piece. Keep it simple. Something familiar. She nodded and smiled back. Her responses were calm and agreeable. She had learned that calm made people comfortable. Comfortable people rarely asked questions. She was shown where to sit while waiting. As she took her seat, she noticed how conversations continued around her without hesitation. People spoke freely, laughed, checked their phones, and discussed unrelated matters. No one lowered their voice because of her presence. No one treated her like a performer preparing for the stage. This was not disrespect. It was assumption. She listened quietly as fragments of conversation drifted past her. Comments about the schedule, about the weather, about how the music would help set a relaxed tone. One person mentioned that background piano always made events feel more polished, even if no one really paid attention. That sentence stayed with her. She looked toward the piano again. It was clean, recently tuned, but ordinary. The bench was placed neatly in front of it, waiting. She imagined herself sitting there, playing the expected notes, and fading into the room like soft lighting. She felt no resistance to that image. She had lived it many times before. As the room slowly filled, the energy remained the same. People greeted one another warmly, finding seats, exchanging small talk. Programs were handed out. The piano was barely mentioned. She noticed how people behaved when they believed nothing surprising would happen. They relaxed completely. They stopped guarding their attention. Their minds stayed open but unfocused. That openness mattered. She checked her hands, stretching her fingers slightly, not out of nerves but routine. Her breathing was steady. Her thoughts were clear. She felt present, grounded in the moment. There was a strange comfort in knowing she was not expected to impress. The pressure that often crushed others never reached her. There was nothing to live up to, nothing to prove, and yet, everything to reveal. When the opening remarks began, she listened attentively. She respected the event and the people who had organized it. She did not see herself as separate from them. She was part of the setting, part of the flow. When her turn approached, she was signaled gently. No announcement built anticipation. No introduction spoke of talent or years of experience. Her role was described briefly, almost casually. She walked to the piano as the room continued to murmur softly. Some people turned their heads. Others did not. A few conversations faded out of politeness rather than interest. She sat down and adjusted the bench. The piano keys felt familiar beneath her fingers, even though this instrument was not the one she practiced on daily. She tested a key lightly, then another, ensuring everything felt right. Silence settled slowly, not because attention sharpened, but because the program moved forward. She began to play the simple tune that had been requested. The melody was gentle, recognizable, and easy to follow. Her touch was controlled, even, and calm. The notes flowed smoothly, filling the space without demanding it. The audience responded exactly as expected. Some listened casually. Some leaned back. Some let the music wash over them without focusing. It became part of the atmosphere, like background light or distant conversation. She watched this from her place at the piano, not with disappointment, but with awareness. This was the moment she had anticipated, the moment when expectations were confirmed. She kept the tempo steady. Her expression remained neutral. Her posture relaxed. Everything about her performance matched what the room believed she was capable of. Inside, she felt something different. She felt time slow slightly. She felt every sound clearly. She felt the room breathing with her, unaware of what it was about to hear. She thought about all the times she had been placed in similar positions. All the times she had been asked to stay within lines drawn by others. All the times she had done exactly that until the right moment arrived. She knew that moment was approaching now, but she did not rush it. She let the simple tune breathe. She let it finish its familiar path. She allowed the audience to settle fully into comfort, into certainty. That certainty was fragile. She reached the final notes of the expected melody and held the last sound just long enough to feel the room relax even more. This was the point where most people would stop, where polite applause would follow, where attention would move on. Her hands hovered above the keys. In that brief pause, no one noticed anything unusual. It felt like a natural ending, a clean conclusion. Then she continued. The shift was subtle at first. A change in harmony, a deeper tone, something unfamiliar woven gently into the familiar space. The volume did not increase suddenly. The intensity did not explode. Instead, it grew. A few people lifted their heads slightly, sensing something different without fully understanding it. Conversations stopped, not because they were told to, but because curiosity interrupted them. Her fingers moved with confidence now, still controlled, but more expressive. The music began to carry weight. Emotion entered the room quietly, like a presence people could feel before they could explain it. She was no longer playing for the room to ignore. She was playing for the room to experience. The sound filled the space fully now, reaching corners it had not touched before. The rhythm strengthened. The melody deepened. The piano was no longer background. Eyes turned. Bodies leaned forward. Attention gathered without effort. She felt it instantly. This was the shift she had prepared for. The moment when assumptions cracked open, leaving space for truth. She did not look at the audience. She did not need to. She could feel them listening, truly listening. The music grew more intense, not wild, but purposeful. Each note landed with intention. Each pause carried meaning. This was not performance for attention. This was expression released at the right time. People sat still now. The room held a different energy. The comfort of predictability had been replaced by something stronger, something alive. She remained calm at the center of it all. This was not a sudden transformation. It was the unveiling of something that had always been there. As the piece continued, disbelief quietly turned into respect. Not because the music was loud, but because it was honest. Because it carried depth that could not be ignored. The simple pianist they had expected was gone. In her place was an artist fully in command of the moment. And the room knew it. She stayed completely present as the music moved forward, aware of every sound but untouched by the sudden shift in attention. What surprised the room did not surprise her. This moment had lived inside her for a long time, practiced quietly, carried patiently, waiting for the right space to breathe. The music now flowed with more color and purpose. The structure was clear, but the emotion underneath gave it weight. It was no longer something meant to fade into the background. It asked to be felt, not explained. At first, the audience tried to understand what they were hearing. Some thought it was still part of the original tune, just slightly extended. Others sensed that something deeper had taken hold, something unexpected. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. Even small sounds, like shifting chairs or soft coughing, disappeared. She could feel the room adjusting. Her hands moved with confidence that came from repetition, not impulse. Every motion had been refined over years of practice that no one had seen. She was not rushing to impress. She was allowing the music to unfold naturally, exactly as it was meant to. The piano responded to her touch with clarity. Each note landed firmly, not harshly, but with intention. The balance between strength and control held the piece together. It was fiery in spirit, but disciplined in form. People who had been leaning back now leaned forward, eyes fixed on her hands, then on her face, searching for signs of effort or strain. They found none. Her expression remained calm, focused, almost peaceful. This calmness made the music even more powerful. She remembered the countless times she had been asked to soften her playing, to keep things gentle, to avoid intensity. Those requests had shaped her understanding of restraint. They had taught her when to hold back and, more importantly, when not to. The piece continued to grow, not through volume alone, but through complexity. Layers of sound built upon one another. Patterns emerged, then shifted. Emotion deepened without becoming chaotic. The audience no longer wondered what would happen next. They were fully inside the moment, following wherever the music led. She felt a quiet sense of release. Not relief, but freedom. Freedom from assumptions, from expectations, from the invisible boundaries placed around her for so long. None of that mattered now. Only the music mattered. She let the tempo rise slightly, just enough to raise the energy in the room. The rhythm became more driving, more urgent, without losing control. It carried the fire she had held back for years, refined and focused rather than wild. A few people exchanged brief glances, not out of confusion, but shared disbelief. They had not expected this depth. They had not prepared themselves to listen this closely. Someone near the front held their breath without realizing it. She remained seated firmly, grounded in the bench, her posture steady. There was no dramatic movement, no showmanship meant to draw attention away from the sound itself. Everything about her stayed centered. That made it impossible to look away. The music now filled every corner of the room. It did not overpower the space, but it claimed it. The piano was no longer an accessory. It was the voice of the moment. She felt the weight of the years behind her, not as burden, but as foundation. Every overlooked performance, every quiet practice session, every moment of restraint had led here, not to prove anything but to express something fully. The piece reached a section that demanded precision. Her fingers moved faster now, clean and deliberate. The complexity was undeniable, but it never felt rushed, felt earned. The audience could sense that this was not a sudden burst of talent. This was mastery revealed, not discovered. A quiet awe settled in the room. She noticed how still everyone had become. Even those who had arrived distracted now sat completely focused. Phones were forgotten. Programs lay untouched in laps. Time felt suspended. She guided the music through a softer passage, allowing the intensity to breathe. The contrast made the earlier fire feel even stronger. Emotion shifted from power to vulnerability, from strength to reflection. This balance mattered to her. She understood that true intensity was not constant force, but controlled contrast. She let the melody soften, then deepen, then rise again, carrying the audience with her. Some felt emotion stir unexpectedly, not because the story behind the music was explained, but because it was felt. The sound spoke in a language that did not require words. She felt connected to the room now, not through eye contact, but through shared experience. Everyone was listening together, without distraction or expectation. The final section approached, and she shaped it carefully. She did not rush toward the end. She allowed the energy to peak naturally, then begin its descent. Her hands slowed slightly. The rhythm settled. The fire did not disappear, but transformed into warmth. Resolution began to take shape. The audience sensed the closing, but remained silent, unwilling to break the spell. She played the final notes with intention, letting each one resonate fully before moving to the next. When the last sound faded, she held her hands above the keys, allowing the silence to speak. That silence was heavy, meaningful, and complete. No one moved. No one clapped immediately. The moment lingered, suspended between disbelief and understanding. She lowered her hands slowly and rested them in her lap. Her breathing remained steady, her expression unchanged. Then the room reacted. The applause did not explode instantly. It grew, starting with a few people who could no longer hold back their response. Then more joined, and more, until the sound filled the space completely. People stood not out of obligation but instinct. Their expressions held genuine admiration, mixed with surprise and respect. She stood calmly and acknowledged the response with a small nod. No exaggerated bow, no dramatic gesture, just quiet acceptance. As the applause continued, she looked out at the room for the first time. Faces met hers with a new awareness. The assumptions that had existed earlier were gone, replaced by something honest. She felt no urge to speak, no need to explain. The music had already said everything. When she left the stage, the energy followed her. Conversations started again, but they were different now. Quieter, more thoughtful. People spoke about what they had just experienced, trying to find words for something that had surprised them deeply. She walked away without lingering, her steps unhurried. The moment did not need to be extended. It had done its work. Inside, she felt steady, not triumphant. She had not conquered anything. She had simply revealed what had always been there. And that was enough. She did not rush away from the moment, but she did not cling to it either. After the applause settled and people returned to their seats, a quiet shift remained in the room. It was the kind of change that could not be undone, even if no one spoke about it out loud. People looked at her differently now. As she stepped off the stage, a few organizers approached her with expressions that mixed surprise and uncertainty. They thanked her again, but this time their voices carried a different tone, slower, more careful, as if they were suddenly aware they had witnessed something they had not planned for. She listened politely, smiled, and nodded. She did not explain herself. She did not say why she had played the way she did. She did not defend or justify anything. She understood that words would only weaken what had already been understood. The turning point had already passed. She moved to the side of the room and stood quietly, letting the event continue around her. The program went on, but the mood had changed. The music lingered in the air long after the piano had gone silent. People whispered to each other, not out of distraction, but reflection. Some shook their heads slowly, as if replaying the moment in their minds. Others sat with their arms crossed, staring forward, still processing what they had heard. She noticed how often people glanced in her direction now. Not boldly, not rudely, just quick looks, filled with curiosity and a new kind of respect. This attention did not make her uncomfortable, but it did not excite her either. She had imagined this moment many times, not as a dream of applause, but as a quiet shift in balance. She felt it now, steady and real. Someone asked her where she had studied. Someone else asked how long she had been playing. The questions came gently, without urgency, but they were questions that had never been asked before. She answered simply. She did not exaggerate her past. She did not downplay it either. She spoke calmly, truthfully, and without drama. The facts were enough. As the event came to an end, people gathered their things slowly. No one rushed out. Small conversations formed around her, careful and respectful. Some thanked her for the music. Others said nothing, but nodded as they passed, their expressions thoughtful. She accepted each response with quiet grace. Inside, she reflected on how quickly perception could change. Not because she had changed, but because she had been seen clearly for the first time. The gap between assumption and reality had closed in a single moment. She stepped outside into the cooler air and took a deep breath. The noise from inside faded behind her, replaced by calm. The world felt grounded again. This was the moment she allowed herself to feel it fully. Not pride, not victory, release. She realized that the weight she had carried for years had lifted slightly. The weight of being unseen, of being misunderstood, of being placed into a smaller shape than she truly was. She knew that one performance did not rewrite her entire life. Opportunities would not suddenly flood in. Recognition would still take time. But something important had shifted inside her. She no longer needed permission. She walked home slowly, letting the evening settle around her. Her mind replayed small details from the performance, not with self-criticism but awareness. The sound of the piano, the silence before the applause, the way the room had leaned in together. She understood now that timing mattered as much as skill, that restraint, when chosen consciously, could be powerful, that being underestimated was not always a disadvantage. At home, she returned to the piano, not to practice, not to analyze, but to reconnect. She played softly, letting her fingers move without structure. The sound filled the room gently, like a conversation continuing after a meaningful pause. She thought about the younger version of herself, the one who practiced alone, the one who accepted small roles without complaint, the one who wondered if being quiet meant being invisible. She wished she could speak to that version now. She would not tell her to push harder or speak louder. She would not tell her to demand more. She would tell her to trust herself, to trust the work, to trust that the right moment would arrive, even if it came quietly. The next few days passed without major changes, but subtle differences appeared. Messages came from people who had attended the event. Some asked if she would be interested in playing again. Others simply said they were still thinking about the music. She replied thoughtfully, without urgency. She did not chase the moment. She allowed it to settle naturally into her life. She returned to her routine, practice, reflection, listening. But something inside her had shifted. She no longer practiced only in preparation. She practiced in ownership. The music was hers, fully and without apology. She noticed a difference in how she carried herself, even outside music. Her posture felt more grounded, her movements more intentional, not because she had something to prove, but because she no longer felt the need to shrink. The turning point was not just what others had seen. It was what she had allowed herself to do. She had trusted her instinct. She had chosen to speak through music when words would have failed. She had chosen to reveal truth instead of asking for approval. And she understood now that this choice could be made again in different ways at different times. The memory of the performance did not fade. It settled into her as a reminder, not of applause, but of alignment. A reminder of what happened when preparation met courage in the right moment. She knew there would still be rooms where she would be underestimated. Still invitations that asked her to stay simple. Still spaces that did not expect much from her. But now, those moments no longer felt limiting. They felt like openings. Because she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She had proven something to herself that no audience could take away. She did not need to announce her depth. She could reveal it when it mattered. And that knowledge stayed with her, steady and unshakable, long after the room had emptied and the piano had gone quiet. In the days that followed, the moment continued to live quietly inside her, shaping how she moved through the world without demanding attention. She did not wake up feeling different, but she noticed small changes in how she carried herself. There was a steadiness now, a calm confidence that did not rely on praise or recognition. She returned to her routine as if nothing dramatic had happened. Mornings still began with practice. Afternoons were still spent listening, learning, refining. Evenings remained quiet. From the outside, her life looked unchanged. But inside, something had settled into place. She understood now that control was not about holding back forever. It was about knowing when to release. When she sat at the piano, she no longer felt the need to ask herself whether she was allowed to play a certain way. The question had disappeared. In its place was trust. Trust in her hands. Trust in her ear. Trust in the years of discipline that had shaped her quietly. She explored music with a new sense of ownership. Not louder, not faster, but clearer. Each note felt intentional. Each pause felt honest. She was no longer trying to fit into an imagined space made by others. She was creating her own. Messages continued to arrive, slowly and unexpectedly. Some were simple, just a few lines expressing appreciation. Others asked questions about her background, her training, her availability. None of the messages felt overwhelming. They felt curious, respectful. She responded thoughtfully, taking her time. She did not rush into anything. She had learned that not every door needed to be opened immediately. Some were better understood before being stepped through. One evening, she was invited to play again, this time at a slightly larger gathering. The request was worded differently. There were fewer instructions. No mention of keeping it simple. No limits placed on what she could or could not do. She noticed that change instantly. She accepted the invitation, not with excitement, but with clarity. She knew what she wanted to bring, and she knew how she wanted to bring it. The moment at the earlier event had not made her reckless. It had made her precise. As she prepared, she reflected on how often people misunderstood confidence. They thought it was about volume, boldness, or constant visibility. She knew better. Confidence, she had learned, was quiet alignment. It was the feeling of standing exactly where you belonged, without forcing anyone else to agree. At the next performance, she approached the piano differently. Not because she was nervous, but because she was aware. The audience watched her closely now. They were ready. They expected something. That expectation did not scare her. It did not pressure her. It reminded her to stay honest. She played with the same control, the same depth, the same restraint. The fire was there, but it was guided. She did not need to shock anyone again. She needed to connect. And she did. Afterward, people spoke to her with openness. Conversations felt balanced. No one talked over her. No one assumed. They listened. She realized how powerful listening could be, and how rare it often was. Still, she did not let this attention define her. She returned home and played for herself, just as she always had. The piano remained a place of truth, not performance. A place where she could experiment, fail, and discover without judgment. She thought often about the idea of command. Not control over others, but command over oneself. Over emotion. over impulse, over fear. She had learned that command came from preparation, not dominance. From patience, not force. There were moments when doubt tried to return. Quiet thoughts that asked whether this change would last, whether the attention would fade, whether she would be overlooked again. She let those thoughts pass without fighting them. She knew now that even if the world returned to old patterns, she would not. She had crossed a line internally that could not be erased. She had seen herself clearly. As time passed, opportunities appeared more naturally. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily. She was invited to collaborate, to contribute, to share ideas rather than just sound. She listened carefully in these spaces. She spoke when it mattered. She played when words were unnecessary. People began to understand her presence not as background, but as substance. Yet she remained grounded. She remembered how easily attention could distract from growth. She remembered how quickly praise could become a trap. She stayed focused on the work itself. There were days when she deliberately chose not to accept invitations. Not out of fear, but discernment. She understood her limits. She respected her energy. Command, she learned, also meant knowing when to say no. She noticed changes beyond music too. In conversations, she spoke with more certainty. In silence, she felt less pressure to fill space. She trusted that her voice, when used thoughtfully, would be heard. People responded to this shift without her announcing it. They leaned in more. They waited. They listened. She realized that command was contagious. When someone stood fully in themselves, others adjusted naturally. One afternoon, she met someone who had known her years ago. Someone who remembered her as quiet, reserved, predictable. Their surprise was gentle but visible. They commented on how much she had grown. She smiled politely, but inside she knew the truth. She had not changed suddenly. She had simply stopped hiding. That distinction mattered to her. In private moments, she reflected on how easily people confused silence with absence. How often they assumed that those who did not demand attention had nothing to offer. She had lived inside that assumption for a long time. Now she saw it clearly. She did not feel angry about it. She felt understanding. She knew that many people were still living quietly, carrying depth that had not yet been seen. She felt connected to them in a way she never had before. When she played now, she played with that awareness. Not just for herself, not just for the audience, but for the unseen effort behind every quiet life. Her music carried that truth. It was controlled, not restrained. Powerful, not loud. Confident, not aggressive. She had learned how to command a room without dominating it. How to lead attention without demanding it. How to express intensity without chaos. That command stayed with her, even when she stepped away from the piano. It showed in how she listened, in how she waited, in how she trusted herself. The world around her did not always change quickly. Some people still underestimated her. Some still placed limits without realizing it. But those limits no longer reached her. She carried her own measure now. And with it came a quiet certainty that whatever came next, she would meet it fully prepared, fully present, and fully herself. The applause and conversations eventually faded, but the impact of that night stayed alive in ways she did not expect. It did not announce itself loudly. It showed up quietly, woven into small moments, subtle reactions, and the way people remembered her long after the room had emptied. Days turned into weeks, and the story of that performance traveled on its own. Not as gossip, not as exaggeration, but as something people felt compelled to mention when they spoke about the event. They did not describe it with technical language. They spoke about how it made them feel, about how the room had changed, about how they had stopped listening casually and started listening deeply without realizing why. She heard these stories secondhand at first. A friend mentioned that someone had asked about her. An organizer reached out again, still sounding thoughtful, still choosing words carefully. There was a tone of respect now that had not been there before. What surprised her most was not the interest, but the reflection it caused in others. Some people admitted openly that they had not expected much from her that night. They said it gently, almost apologetically, as if confessing something they had only just realized about themselves. They spoke about assumptions, about how easily they had placed her into a quiet category without knowing her story. She listened without judgment. She knew that these moments were not about blame. They were about awareness, about people recognizing how often they decided what someone was capable of before giving them space to show it. For her, this realization mattered more than applause ever could. She noticed changes in how people approached her now. Conversations were slower, more intentional. People asked questions and waited for answers instead of filling silence. They gave her room to speak, to think, to respond. She saw how quickly behavior shifted once perception changed. At the same time, she remained careful not to let this new attention define her identity. She understood how fragile recognition could be, how quickly it could fade if fed too much importance. She stayed grounded in the work itself. Music remained her center. When she practiced, she did so with the same focus she had always had. She still repeated difficult sections. She still explored sound patiently. She still allowed herself to struggle in private. But now she practiced with a deeper sense of meaning. She was no longer preparing just for herself. She was preparing to honor the trust that had been placed in her, even if that trust had come late. She began to receive invitations that felt different. They did not ask her to stay within limits. They did not define what kind of music she should play. They asked what she wanted to share. This question stayed with her. She realized how rarely she had been asked that before. In these new spaces, she noticed how carefully people listened when expectations were removed, how open they became when they allowed themselves not to predict the outcome. She played with this awareness, shaping her performances not to shock, but to guide. She wanted people to feel included in the experience, not surprised by it. After one performance, someone approached her quietly and said that watching her had changed how they listened to others. That comment stayed with her longer than any compliment about technique or talent. It reminded her that impact did not always look like success. Sometimes it looked like awareness. She also noticed how her story affected people who felt overlooked themselves. They spoke to her about feeling unseen in their own work, their own lives. They told her how meaningful it was to watch someone step into their depth without asking permission. She did not offer advice. She did not position herself as an example to follow. She simply listened. She knew that each person's moment would arrive differently. That timing could not be forced. That preparation often happened quietly, without witnesses. She saw her younger self reflected in many of these conversations. People who carried skill, care, and depth without recognition. People who were patient not because they lacked ambition, but because they trusted their process. She felt a deep connection to them. At times, she wondered how close she had come to giving up, how easily her story could have gone unnoticed forever if she had chosen frustration over patience. That thought did not fill her with regret. It filled her with gratitude. Gratitude for the discipline that kept her grounded, for the quiet spaces that allowed her to grow without pressure, for the moment when everything aligned naturally. She also reflected on how fragile assumptions could be. One night had shifted years of perception, not because she demanded attention, but because she allowed truth to surface when no one expected it. She understood now that many people walked through life carrying unseen strength, that the loudest voices were not always the most capable, that silence often held more than people imagined. This understanding shaped how she moved forward. She became more intentional about creating space for others, not by speaking over them, but by listening, by noticing, by not rushing to decide who someone was before giving them time. In her own performances, she began to leave room for silence, moments where the audience could breathe, reflect, and connect. She learned that silence was not empty. It was powerful. People responded to this approach deeply. They left performances not buzzing with noise, but thoughtful. Some said they felt changed in small ways. Others said they felt seen. She realized then that her impact extended beyond music. It reached into how people perceived potential, how they measured talent, how they approached quiet individuals in their lives. That knowledge humbled her. She did not feel above anyone. She felt among them. As her story continued to spread quietly, she remained cautious. She knew that moments could be exaggerated over time. She stayed true to the reality of what had happened. She corrected assumptions gently when needed. She was not interested in becoming a symbol. She was interested in staying human. When she looked back on the night that had started it all, she no longer saw it as a turning point defined by surprise. She saw it as a moment of alignment, a moment where preparation met opportunity without resistance. The aftermath was not dramatic. It was steady, and that steadiness mattered. She continued to grow not in leaps, but in layers, each experience adding depth rather than noise, each invitation offering a new perspective rather than validation. She remained open to being underestimated again, not because she expected it, but because she knew it no longer threatened her. She had learned that being seen was not about visibility alone. It was about being understood. And understanding, once earned, changed everything. As time moved forward, the memory of that first unexpected performance softened. It became part of her foundation, not her definition. She carried it with her quietly, like a reminder of what was possible when patience met courage. The world around her continued to move, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. People came and went. Opportunities rose and faded. But one thing remained constant. She trusted herself now. And that trust shaped every note she played, every space she entered, and every moment she chose to speak or remain silent. The aftermath was not an ending. It was a widening of the path she had always been walking, now illuminated just enough for others to finally see it too. With time, the moment that once felt extraordinary slowly settled into something quieter and more meaningful. It stopped being a story about surprise and became a story about understanding. Not just for others, but for her most of all. She no longer replayed the performance in her mind the way she once had. It was no longer a peak she feared she might never reach again. It had become part of her foundation, steady and dependable, something she could stand on without looking back. What stayed with her was not the applause or the attention, but the clarity that followed. She understood now who she was when no one was watching, and who she could be when everyone was. Those two versions no longer felt separate. She had spent years believing that being quiet meant being small, that patience meant waiting to be chosen, that discipline meant staying within the lines others drew. Now she knew better. Quiet could hold strength. Patience could shape power. Discipline could create freedom. This understanding changed how she approached everything. When she entered new spaces, she no longer tried to adjust herself to fit what she thought was expected. She observed, listened, and responded honestly. If the space was open, she shared fully. If it was limited, she remained herself without shrinking. She stopped measuring her worth by how others reacted. Some audiences still underestimated her at first. She noticed it in the casual greetings, the polite smiles, the lack of curiosity. These moments no longer stirred anything heavy inside her. They felt familiar, almost neutral. She knew what came next, whether it arrived that day or years later. She carried her depth without urgency. Music continued to be her language, but it no longer carried the burden of proof. It was no longer something she used to convince others. It was something she used to connect, to explore, to express what words could not hold. She became more selective with her choices, not because she felt above anyone, but because she valued alignment. She learned that not every opportunity was meant to be accepted, and not every stage was meant to be stepped onto. Saying no became an act of respect, not fear. She also began mentoring quietly, without titles or announcements. People sought her out, often unsure why they felt comfortable opening up to her. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, her words were simple and grounded. She never told anyone to wait for their moment. She told them to prepare in ways that made sense to them. She reminded them that visibility and value were not the same thing, that growth often happened without witnesses, that timing could not be forced but readiness could be built. These conversations mattered to her deeply. They reminded her of the person she once was, sitting alone at a piano, wondering if her work would ever be enough, wondering if anyone would ever truly listen. She understood now that being enough was never the problem. Being seen was, and being seen required courage at the right moment, not noise at every moment. As her journey continued, she noticed how differently she handled uncertainty. Before, uncertainty had felt like rejection waiting to happen. Now, it felt like possibility without pressure. She trusted herself to respond when needed. Life, of course, did not become perfect. There were still disappointments, invitations that went nowhere, moments when effort did not lead to recognition. She felt these things, but they no longer defined her direction. She no longer needed external confirmation to stay committed to her path. Her sense of purpose had shifted inward. She played music not to be remembered, but to be present. She performed not to impress, but to communicate. She practiced not because she feared falling behind, but because she loved the process of refining something honest. The fire she once revealed did not burn constantly on the surface. It lived deeper now, steady and enduring. It warmed her choices rather than consuming them. People continued to describe her as calm, but now they meant something different. They meant grounded, assured, intentional. They no longer confused calm with limitation. She noticed how this shift influenced how others treated her. Not with awe, not with distance, but with trust. They trusted her judgment. They trusted her silence. They trusted her presence. That trust mattered more than attention ever had. When she looked back on the modest invitation that started everything, she smiled gently. It had not been a test. It had been an opening created not by chance, but by years of quiet preparation. She understood now that life rarely announces its turning points. They arrive disguised as ordinary moments, modest requests, simple opportunities. What mattered was how ready you were when they arrived. She remained committed to staying ready, not in a tense or anxious way, but in a grounded one. Ready to listen, ready to respond, ready to reveal truth when it mattered. She no longer feared being asked to stay small. She knew she could begin small and still go deep. The world around her continued to move quickly, chasing louder stories, brighter moments, instant recognition. She moved differently, with intention, with patience, with trust. Her story was not one of sudden transformation. It was one of gradual alignment. She had not become someone else. She had become fully herself. And that, she understood, was the most powerful masterpiece she could ever create.